power behind the throne. In 1914, when World War I broke out, Rasputin's influence reached its peak. Tsar Nicholas II personally took command of the Russian armed forces, leaving the administration of the empire in the hands of his wife Alexandra, and Alexandra in turn left almost all important decisions in Rasputin's hands. The result was disastrous. Rasputin had no formal education, much less experience governing an empire. His decisions were based on superstitions, personal interests, and a primitive understanding of politics. He appointed and dismissed ministers as if they were domestic servants, sold government positions to the highest bidder, and used his influence to protect friends and punish enemies. But perhaps most shocking was his personal behavior. Rasputin was known for his debauchery. He frequented brothels, drank excessively, and claimed that sinning was necessary to find redemption. His parties were legendary for their licentiousness and rumors about his love affairs, including supposedly with the Tsarina herself, spread throughout St. Petersburg. For a society already shaken by war and economic crisis, the idea that a drunk and promiscuous peasant was effectively governing the empire was intolerable. The Russian aristocracy saw Rasputin as an existential threat not only to the Tsarist regime, but to Russian civilization itself. And then the more sinister rumors began. Some believed Rasputin was actually a German agent, working to sabotage the Russian war effort. Others suspected he had plans to overthrow the monarchy and become the leader of a new theocratic Russia. The truth was probably simpler. Rasputin was an opportunist who had found an infinite source of power and had no intention of giving it up. In 1914, when World War I broke out, Rasputin's influence reached its peak. Tsar Nicholas II personally took command of the Russian armed forces, leaving the administration of the empire in the hands of his wife Alexandra, and Alexandra in turn left almost all important decisions in Rasputin's hands. The result was disastrous. Rasputin had no formal education, much less experience governing an empire. His decisions were based on superstitions, personal interests, and a primitive understanding of politics. He appointed and dismissed ministers as if they were domestic servants, sold government positions to the highest bidder, and used his influence to protect friends and punish enemies. But perhaps most shocking was his personal behavior. Rasputin was known for his debauchery. He frequented brothels, drank excessively, and claimed that sinning was necessary to find redemption. His parties were legendary for their licentiousness and rumors about his love affairs, including supposedly with the Tsarina herself, spread throughout St. Petersburg. For a society already shaken by war and economic crisis, the idea that a drunk and promiscuous peasant was effectively governing the empire was intolerable. The Russian aristocracy saw Rasputin as an existential threat not only to the Tsarist regime, but to Russian civilization itself. And then the more sinister rumors began. Some believed Rasputin was actually a German agent, working to sabotage the Russian war effort. Others suspected he had plans to overthrow the monarchy and become the leader of a new theocratic Russia. The truth was probably simpler. Rasputin was an opportunist who had found an infinite source of power and had no intention of giving it up. Imagine a man who drank enough poison to kill 10 people and kept asking for more wine. A man who took bullets to the chest and back, but still managed to drag his assassins across the floor. A man who was thrown into the icy waters of the Neva River and, even then, tried to escape from under the ice. This isn't an urban legend or a horror movie. This is the real story of the death of Grigori Rasputin, the mystical monk who controlled the Russian royal family, and whose death became one of the most bizarre and controversial in history. December 1916. The Russian Empire was crumbling. World War I was devastating the country, and at the center of it all was a Siberian peasant with piercing eyes who whispered secrets in the Tsarina's ear. His name was feared in the aristocratic salons of St. Petersburg, and his influence over the Romanov family was considered a threat to the very survival of the empire. But how did a simple peasant gain so much power? And why did his death require poison, bullets, and ice water to finally be accomplished? The answer to these questions leads us to one of the most elaborate conspiracies in Russian history, involving desperate nobles, medieval assassination methods, and a man whose legend grew so large that we still question whether he was truly just human. Prepare to discover the truth behind a man whom death itself seemed to fear. To understand why Rasputin had to die, we first need to understand how he came to power. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born in 1869 in a small Siberian village called Pokrovskoye. He was the son of a common peasant, but from a young age, he showed characteristics that set him apart from others. At 18, he had a religious experience that would change his life forever, or at least that's what he claimed. The truth is that Rasputin was a master at reading people. He understood that in a deeply religious and superstitious Russia, a man who claimed to have divine powers could go very far. And that's exactly what happened. He developed a reputation as a healer and mystic, traveling from city to city, accumulating followers, and, more importantly, accumulating connections with influential people. But what truly catapulted Rasputin to the center of power was his apparently supernatural ability to help Tsar Nicholas II's son, Alexei. The boy suffered from hemophilia, a hereditary disease that prevented blood clotting. Any injury could be fatal. The court doctors were powerless before the condition, but Rasputin could make the bleeding stop. How is this possible? Some theories suggest hypnosis, others point to advanced herbal knowledge, and there are those who believe he truly possessed supernatural powers. What we know for certain is that it worked, and when you can save the heir to the Russian throne, you gain unprecedented access to power. Tsarina Alexandra, desperate to protect her son, became completely dependent on Rasputin. She consulted him about everything, from medical treatments to political decisions. And here's where the story becomes truly dangerous. With Tsar Nicholas II frequently absent dealing with the war, Rasputin effectively began governing Russia through the Tsarina. By the end of 1916, the situation had become unsustainable. Russia was losing the war, the economy was collapsing, and popular revolts were beginning to break out throughout the empire. The Russian aristocracy reached an inevitable conclusion. As long as Rasputin lived, the empire would die. But killing Rasputin would not be a simple task. He was extraordinarily cautious, always surrounded by loyal followers, and had the disturbing habit of seeming to know when he was in danger. Moreover, any assassination attempt would have to be absolutely discreet. If it were discovered that the aristocracy had killed the Tsarina's spiritual advisor, the consequences would be catastrophic. The conspiracy was led by Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the richest men in Russia and member of one of the oldest families in the aristocracy. Yusupov hated Rasputin with a passion that bordered on obsession. He saw the mystic as an abomination, a stain on Russian honor that needed to be removed at any cost. Along with Yusupov were Vladimir Purishkevich, a conservative politician and fervent monarchist, and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, cousin of the Tsar himself. Dmitry's presence in the conspiracy was particularly significant. It meant that even the royal family was turning against Rasputin. The plan they devised was diabolical in its simplicity. Yusupov would invite Rasputin to his palace under the pretext of introducing him to his beautiful wife, Irina. Rasputin, known for his weakness for aristocratic women, would surely accept. Once in the palace, they would kill him and dispose of the body, making it appear that he had simply disappeared. But they gravely underestimated the man they were trying to kill. On the night of December 29, 1916, Rasputin received the invitation he had been waiting for. Prince Yusupov had finally agreed to introduce him to his famous wife, and the meeting would be at the luxurious Moika Palace. Rasputin, always vain and confident in his charm, wore his best clothes, an embroidered silk shirt, velvet pants, and his finest leather boots. What Rasputin didn't know was that Irina wasn't even in St. Petersburg that night, and what awaited him in the palace basement wasn't a socialite fascinated by mysticism, but a table full of sweets and wine contaminated with enough cyanide to kill 20 men. Yusupov led Rasputin to the basement, explaining that they would have to wait because Irina was still finishing getting ready. In the meantime, why didn't Rasputin try some of the delicious sweets that had been prepared especially for the occasion? And perhaps a little wine to accompany them? Rasputin, always with a good appetite, began devouring the poisoned sweets. He ate cake after cake, drank glass after glass of wine, while Yusupov watched with growing horror. According to the plan, Rasputin should have died after the first cake, but there he was, 40 minutes later, asking for more wine and wondering when Irina would finally come down. The cyanide simply wasn't working. Later theories would suggest that the sugar in the sweets may have neutralized the poison, or that the acidity of the wine made it ineffective. But at the time, for Yusupov and his co-conspirators hiding upstairs, it seemed like they were trying to kill the devil himself. Desperate, Yusupov went upstairs to consult his companions. They had to change tactics. Grand Duke Dmitri suggested they simply leave and try again another time, but Purishkevich insisted this was the only chance they would have. Yusupov, trembling with nervousness and determination, took Dmitri's revolver and returned to the basement. "Grigori Efimovich," said Yusupov, using Rasputin's real name, "you would do better to look at crucifix and say a prayer." Rasputin, finally sensing the danger, turned to see Yusupov pointing a gun at him, but before he could react, the shot echoed through the basement. The bullet hit Rasputin in the chest, throwing him back against the table. He fell to the floor and lay motionless. Yusupov ran upstairs to tell the others it was done. They waited a few minutes to be sure, and then all came down together to see the body. Rasputin lay on the floor in a pool of blood, his eyes closed, apparently dead. But when Yusupov bent down to check his pulse, the unthinkable happened. Rasputin's eyes suddenly opened, wild and furious. With an inhuman roar, he grabbed Yusupov by the throat and stood up, dragging the terrified prince with him. "Felix! Felix!" screamed Rasputin in a voice that didn't sound human. "You killed me! You killed me!" The other conspirators were paralyzed with terror. Here was a man who had ingested enough poison to kill an elephant and taken a bullet to the chest, but was still standing, fighting like a possessed demon. Yusupov managed to break free and ran upstairs, screaming that Rasputin had come back from the dead. Rasputin, bleeding profusely but still conscious, began climbing the stairs after Yusupov. He managed to reach the palace courtyard, where he tried to escape through the main door, but Purishkevich was waiting. With trembling hands, he fired 4 shots at Rasputin. 2 missed, but one hit his back and another his head. This time, Rasputin finally fell and lay still, but the conspirators had learned not to trust appearances. Yusupov picked up a heavy bludgeon and began beating the already motionless body, determined to be absolutely certain that Rasputin was dead. Even so, the assassins' paranoia was such that they decided to take one final precaution. They tied up Rasputin's body, placed it in a carpet, and transported it to the Neva River, which was frozen by the harsh Russian winter. They made a hole in the ice and threw the body into the icy waters. According to their logic, even if Rasputin was somehow still alive, the freezing water would surely kill him. They were wrong. 3 days later, Rasputin's body was found by local fishermen. The autopsy revealed water in his lungs, indicating he had drowned, meaning he was alive when thrown into the river. Even more shocking, investigators found evidence that Rasputin had tried to free himself from the ropes. His nails were broken and bloody, suggesting he had fought desperately to escape from under the ice. The medical examiner concluded that Rasputin had survived the poison, survived the gunshots, and only finally died by drowning after a prolonged struggle under the ice. It was as if death itself had needed 3 attempts to finally claim this extraordinary man. Rasputin's death did not save the Russian Empire. In fact, it may have accelerated its fall. Tsarina Alexandra was devastated by the loss of her spiritual advisor and withdrew even further from public life. Tsar Nicholas II, already overwhelmed by the pressures of war, lost one of the few people his wife trusted completely. More importantly, the assassination demonstrated that even the royal family wasn't safe. If nobles could conspire to kill the Tsarina's closest advisor, what would stop them from conspiring against the Romanovs themselves? The conspiracy was also poorly executed from a political standpoint. The assassins expected to be seen as heroes who saved Russia, but the common people saw Rasputin differently. For many peasants, he was one of the few powerful men who truly cared about them. His death was seen not as a patriotic act, but as another example of the aristocracy destroying anyone who threatened their privileges. Grand Duke Dmitri was exiled, which probably saved his life when the revolution finally came. Purishkevich was temporarily imprisoned but later released. Yusupov, ironically, became a celebrity, telling and retelling the story of the assassination to anyone who would listen. But Rasputin's story didn't end with his death. In fact, in many ways, it was just the beginning. Less than 2 months after his assassination, the February Revolution overthrew Tsar Nicholas II. A year later, the entire Romanov family was dead, executed by the Bolsheviks in the city of Ekaterinburg. It would be an exaggeration to say that Rasputin's death caused the Russian Revolution, but it certainly removed one of the few figures who still kept the royal family united and focused. Alexandra lost not only her advisor, but her spiritual anchor. Nicholas lost the only person who could calm his hysterical wife and maintain some semblance of family stability. Even more fascinating are the legends that grew around Rasputin's death. Each retelling of the story adds new bizarre details. Some say he predicted his own death and left a letter prophesying the fall of the Romanovs. Others claim his ghost still haunts the Moika Palace. There are those who believe he truly possessed supernatural powers and that his resistance to death was proof of his mystical abilities. The scientific truth is probably more mundane. Rasputin was an exceptionally robust man, with an uncommon tolerance for alcohol and drugs developed over years of excess. The cyanide may have been of poor quality or neutralized by the food. The first bullet may have missed vital organs. His final resistance may have been simply adrenaline and willpower. But perhaps the scientific explanation misses the point. What makes Rasputin such a fascinating figure isn't the specific details of how he died, but what his death represented. Here was a Siberian peasant who, through a combination of charm, intelligence, and pure audacity, managed to reach the center of world power. He influenced decisions that affected millions of lives, altered the course of a world war, and indirectly contributed to the end of a 300-year dynasty. And when the established elite finally decided he had to die, they discovered that eliminating Rasputin was almost as difficult as controlling him had been. He fought against death with the same fierce tenacity he had used to conquer power, refusing to go quietly even when confronted with poison, bullets, and ice water. Rasputin's story reminds us that true power doesn't necessarily come from noble birth or privileged education, but from the ability to understand what people truly want and need. Alexandra needed someone who could save her son. Nicholas needed someone who could calm his wife. The Russian peasants needed someone who would represent them in the palace. Rasputin filled all these needs, and for a time was indispensable. But absolute power corrupts absolutely, and eventually even the most charismatic man can become more of a threat than a solution. The conspiracy to kill Rasputin was motivated by fear. Fear that one man had too much power. Fear that Russia was in the hands of someone inadequate. Fear that the empire was doomed as long as he lived. Ironically, his death removed one of the last obstacles to the revolution the conspirators were trying to prevent. Today, more than a century later, we still debate whether Rasputin was a brilliant charlatan, a genuine mystic, or simply an ordinary man who found himself in extraordinary circumstances. What we know for certain is that he was one of the last great characters in world history, a figure so larger than life that even his death became legendary. And perhaps that's the most important lesson from the story of Grigori Rasputin. In a world that sometimes seems predictable and controlled, there's still room for figures who defy all expectations, who refuse to follow the rules, and who, even in death, continue to fascinate and inspire. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more extraordinary stories from world history. And tell me in the comments, do you believe Rasputin truly possessed supernatural powers, or was he simply an exceptional man in unique circumstances? Until next time.